There had not been an unscheduled incursion across the Sirotheen border in over 7 galactic cycles. And yet this one came quietly, without distortion fields, without stealth codes, without even the courtesy of encrypted deception. The breach had been deliberate, surgically precise in its trajectory, and most alarmingly, casual, as if the vessel had either not known the weight of the rules it defied or worse, knew them too well, and judged them beneath response. Admiral Kul-Varran stood at the core pit of the Vorak's silence, his station carved in circular geometry that reflected the rigidity of the command protocols he had enforced for nearly 2 centuries. His posture coiled with the elegance of someone who had never once seen war, because his mere presence had prevented either, was tall by Sirotheen standards. Armored in synaptic silk, his eyes bleached blue from orbital augmentation, and his voice, the instrument of 1,000 deterrent packs, was measured not in tone, but in the length of its silence. As beside him stood sub-strategist Vale Tyr, a younger mind yet to be worn, smooth by protocol, sharper in analytics, more inclined to observe anomalies than crush them. Tyr had reviewed the telemetry of the incoming ship and spoken the words no one on the command deck wanted to validate. Terran origin. Sir, civilian class. Identified as Equinox. Kul-Varran's gaze remained steady on the holo projection, watching the small Terran vessel float like a rift shard against the backdrop of the Nebula Bastion. Its drive trails cold, its signal unwavering. Civilian, you say? Then why does it cross an exclusion zone without escort, without clearance, without fear? Perhaps because they expect an audience, Tyr replied cautiously. Not a firing solution. Expectations, Kul-Varran murmured, are what brought the Jurix rebellion to cinders and cost us the Ember Accord. I will not indulge a Terran delusion of parity. Open a diplomatic hail. Demand purpose. Brevity required. The message was sent across a diplomatic frequency, so archaic it hadn't been used since the reconciliation talks with the Vale Sewer. A species long extinct, the reply came faster than anticipated. This is Ambassador Helena, Voss of the Terran neutral ship Equinox. I am authorized by the Interstellar Civil Council of Earth to request audience with the Sirotheen Command. We do not seek territory. We do not offer alliance. We ask only for 15 minutes of your attention. Tyr blinked, parsing the syntax once more, lips parting slightly. It's a request for conversation, not concession. No demands. No threats. Just that Kul-Varran said nothing, but internally, he began cataloging the possibilities probe disguise. Diplomatic feint, cultural misdirection, psychological gambit. Humans were known for this. After all, not because they were deceptive by nature, but because they had learned to survive in a galaxy that preferred predictable enemies. He had never faced a human in negotiation. He had studied them. Of course, files thick with contradictions, violent and diplomatic, tribal yet cooperative, capable of extinction-level retaliation, and yet curiously obsessed with restraint. He had always assumed they postured because they had little else to offer, and yet this ship had come alone. No formation, no shields raised, no emergency beacon, just a voice, just a question. 15 minutes. Kul-Varran repeated, tasting the phrase like a test embedded with triggers. What could possibly be said in 15 minutes that warrants risking a fleet's wrath? Tyr did not answer, because it was already too late to ignore the question. There were protocols for moments like this, ancient and layered, etched into Sirotheen jurisprudence across generations of enforced peace protocols that dictated immediate isolation, forced relay rerouting, or, if necessary, quiet elimination in the name of regional stability. And yet, Orak's silence did none of these things. Instead, the Dreadnoughta, Leviathan bristling with dormant weapons that hadn't needed to fire in over a century, adjusted its orbital drift to bring the Terran ship into full view, positioning itself with the precision of a ceremonial execution. platform rather than a war engine still. The Equinox did not alter course did not break formation did not broadcast a distress call. It remained steady, as though its pilot were not simply unafraid, but unaware that they should have been afraid at all. Helena Voss, by all biometric readings, was alive, calm, and unshielded, her vitals transmitted openly with none of the obscuring lattice interference typical of cautious species. Her blood pressure was low, her posture relaxed, her left eye augmented with an old Terran orbital relay model civilian tech. Nothing sophisticated, nothing that could be weaponized without drawing attention. Kul-Varran narrowed his eyes at the O. Readout, speaking with that dangerous clarity unique to those who rarely needed to repeat themselves. Send a visual request. One-way link. No audio. I wish to see the face of the one who dares treat us as peers. The image blinked to life. Voss appeared as expected. Human female, midlife cycle. Terran skin hue lightly bronzed, hair tied with utilitarian function, seated before a plain metallic backdrop, with no flag, no emblem, no decorative pretense. She looked directly into the link feed as if she'd known when they would activate it. He offered no smile. She blinked once, slowly, and then she nodded, once neither submissive nor defiant, merely acknowledging presence. With the solemn dignity of someone entering a room they understood was not theirs, but where they still intended to speak. It was Tyr who spoke first, his voice betraying a trace of curiosity he could not quite mask. She waits for permission. That's rare. No, Kul-Varran said, his voice sharp. That's strategic. She wants us to believe we are in control. Every gesture is calculated. This is not humility. It is a performance calibrated to disarm. And yet, the longer he watched, the more something else began to stir within his mind. Not suspicion, not wariness, but irritation at how cleanly she defied the patterns he had studied. No diplomatic entourage, no manipulation of urgency, no declarations of cultural parity or historic grievance, just a single ship, a single envoy, and a message looped every 37 seconds. We request conversation, not concession. Tyr hesitated, then turned. Shall I activate defensive protocols? No. Kul-Varran answered slowly. Not yet. Let us observe how a creature makes war with only words. Aboard the Equinox, Voss sat without motion, aware that every scan, every spectrotemporal probe, every silent algorithm of threat assessment was being leveled against her, not because she posed danger, but because her absence of it was far more disconcerting. The translator chip in her ear remained quiet. Her crew, if they could even be called that, were 4 and number 3 analysts and a linguist, none military, all trained in soft sciences. All silent as she waited. One of them, a thin man with salt mist skin and worn eyes, leaned toward her and whispered, "They haven't responded. You think they'll open fire without notice? If they do," she said without looking up, "it confirms everything we came to say. And if they don't," now she turned, just enough for him to feel the weight of her thought, "then we begin with a very old truth. That speaking without shouting is still a form of strength. Far above, Borak's silence held position, thousands of weapons idling, sensors drawn so tightly across the Terran vessel that the ship's carbon emissions had been mapped to a 3-dimensional stress profile. But Helena Voss did not so much as exhale differently. Send her a single phrase. Kul-Varran said at last, "Nothing more." What phrase? "Admiral, state your purpose before protocol forces our hand." Tyr hesitated, then transmitted it 8 words that had ended empires, reduced a rogue species to memory, and brokered surrender from sovereign fleets. The human ship received the message. There was a delay, but only long enough to feel intentional. Then her voice filled the deck low, composed, and unbroken by static. "My name is Ambassador Helena Voss. We came not for your fear, but your attention." The bridge fell quiet. It was not the message they expected. and because it wasn't, it demanded to be heard. The Council's archive of Terran behavioral matrices vast, meticulously updated, and cross-referenced through 7 interspecies models of psychological forecasting, had nothing that prepared them for this exact combination of elements. Civilian vessel crossing an enforced demarcation without shield signatures, an unarmed diplomat requesting nothing but audience, and most disturbing of all, the complete absence of any known leverage play. It was this deviation, not the intrusion itself, that troubled Kul-Varran as he descended into the ship's internal projection chamber, where the full-dimensional behavioral mapping system called the Hair View waited to render the human envoy's profile in silent holographic judgment. With a simple gesture, the chamber bloomed to life. Helena Voss stood projected in static calm, her posture read and parsed by threat models, her tone dissected across emotional matrices. And still the system returned what could only be described as a diplomatic anomaly: high composure, low evasion markers, negligible aggression profiles, and a psychological center weighted not around domination or appeasement, but inquiry. This is either a very precise deception, Kul-Varran said aloud, his tone more surgical than skeptical, or it is something we are not yet trained to confront. Valtir, standing behind the Admiral with a data spike in hand, leaned forward slightly, voice soft. They are not escalating, not posturing, and their comms bandwidth is not encrypted. Sir, they are offering transparency in the rawest form, which is exactly why it is dangerous, Kul-Varran replied. No one is this transparent unless they've calculated how transparency itself can become a shield. On screen, Voss moved only to sip from a plain silver vessel, her hand steady, her gaze never lowered. Her biometrics indicated neither adrenaline spike nor fear markers. This was not confidence born of ignorance. This was preparedness. They know our playbook. Tyr muttered. Kul-Varran's reply came slower than usual, as though the admission cost him something. They may have written a new one. On the Equinox, Voss received the silent tension of the Sirotheen command in much the same way one receives the stare of a predator from across a clearing calmly, without denial of danger, but without ceding ground either. She knew the Varek's silence was capable of planetary glassing within 9 minutes of system initiation. She knew its core weapon, the crescent dissonant, could not be detected until it had already fired. She knew they were being scanned so deeply that even the molecular fatigue of her shoulder implant had been assessed. And still, she had offered them not her defense, but her position. We have observed, she said aloud, this time recording a full statement intended for the response archives, that your command style relies on the anticipation of fear. Our purpose is to remove that anticipation. Her speech was transmitted without distortion, every word sharp and quiet like an artisan's blade. We come not as aggressors nor as supplicants. We are not a fleet. We are not a delegation of power. We are a hypothesis that peace can be proposed without hierarchy. Her assistant Lesmera, social linguist and former interspecies trauma analyst, raised an eyebrow from behind the navigation. Halotable. You think they'll hear that as anything but provocation? I think, Voss replied without turning. They will hear it as a threat precisely because it is not one. Back aboard the Varek's silence. The holotranscript played once more in full silence afterward. There was a pause. Then Tyr cleared his throat, making a bid not for negotiation, but for reframing the protocol itself. This isn't diplomacy. It's ideological confrontation. She's offering to be judged, not by strength or allegiance, but by reason. Reason is not a stable currency, Kul-Varran muttered. In this quadrant, it rarely survives contact with consequence, and yet she wagers everything on it, which is why I must assume the gamble hides something else, Kul-Varran said. A Terran envoy does not approach a known enforcer ship unless they believe Destruction benefits them in some long-term calculus, so you believe she wants us to strike her down. No, the Admiral said softly. I believe she's made peace with either outcome. And species who do not fear loss are more dangerous than any fleet. He stood still for a long moment, watching the projection of the woman who had said so little, asked for so little, and yet managed to unbalance a strategic mind that had survived 5 regime shifts and 3 mutinies without ever once needing to raise his voice. Open her transmission logs, he said. All of them. I want to know what she's broadcasting, who she's addressing, and what species are meant to be listening when we choose our response. Tyr gave a tight nod and turned to the control dais. And if it's not a broadcast, Kul-Varran's reply was almost inaudible, then it is a mirror. And we will have no choice but to see what we've become. The logs of the Equinox were not encrypted. That alone would have been an insult to the Sirotheen's intelligence, had it come from any other species. But here, from humanity as civilization, whose information warfare units were rumored to dismantle whole regimes using misquoted treaties and viral social models, it was something else entirely. It was trust or something more unnerving than trust-calculated vulnerability. The data flowed without resistance. No traps. No embedded logic bombs. Just plain transmissions archived across multiple sectors, not aimed at any single species, but open. Intentionally open. Timed broadcasts spread across civilian relays, planetary cultural networks, and obsolete diplomatic interlinks no longer maintained by most Concord species. A web of access designed not for speed, but for resonance. Kul-Varran watched them from the deep focus well of the diplomatic chamber. Each message was a thread of something larger, not declarations, not reports, but narratives. They were titled under one growing collection, not the Doctrine of Terran Constraint. There were no logos on the files, no planetary sigils, no military credits, only plain documentation of events, records of what humanity had not done, places where their fleets had stood at the edge of engagement and withdrawn, cultures they had outpaced technologically but had left uncolonized, conflicts they could have won but chose instead to mitigate, resolve, or simply leave alone. Each file followed the same quiet structure. Case, Karasi Refugee Corridor. Date to 78.4.231, Tay Summary. Refugees permitted Terran orbital passage despite biorisk index. No demands for assimilation. Terran resources used for passive observation, trauma processing, and voluntary reintegration protocols. Result: Karasi resurgence 2 decades later. No tribute paid. No territories annexed. No claim of credit filed. Another file. Case: Selene. Compact Collapse Summary. Treaty negotiations initiated by Terran scholar diplomats between rival planetary factions. No armed escorts dispatched. No political gains secured. Resolution achieved over 47 cycles. Sol System declined honorary stewardship. And another. Case: Biovori Quarantine Incident Summary. Threat of terraforming nanoplague. Human fleet arrived in force but left weapons unprimed. Chose planetary self-containment and humanitarian. Aid delivery by drone. Zero retaliatory measures despite losses. No colony effort pursued. Veltir leaned closer over the console. Expression unreadable. They are documenting all the times they could have behaved like us and chose not to. It's not documentation, Kul-Varran said quietly. It's a counter-doctrine, a statement of philosophy without declaration. It's restraint, Tyr added. Used as proof. The Admiral said nothing. There was a tension in his shoulders, now that had not been there before, an awareness not of danger, but of conceptual challenge, the kind that digs under tactical logic and lodges somewhere closer to belief. The Equinox. Meanwhile, continued broadcasting the files with passive consistency. No retaliation, no ultimatum, just patience. Do you think they mean to embarrass us? Tyr asked carefully. No, Kul-Varran said slowly. I think they mean to force a re-evaluation, not of our strength, but of the assumptions that justify it. He turned from the console and stood before the central sphere of the bridge, the place where judgment was delivered, not on enemies, but on courses of action, and in the moment between. One breath and the next, something long calcified inside his thinking began to loosen, because what he had seen in those files was not the mark of a naive civilization unaware of power, but a species fully cognizant of what they could have done, and the burden they had accepted by doing otherwise. They had not come to ask for passage. They had come to confront a moral imbalance with evidence of another way later. As protocol required, Kul-Varran delivered a provisional analysis to the Central Concord Archive. His words were calm, his tone perfectly measured. The human vessel Equinox has breached demarcation unarmed and unescorted. No offensive signals transmitted. Their envoy, Ambassador Helena Voss, has presented a conceptual file titled The Doctrine of Terran Constraint. It documents instances of voluntary non-dominance across multiple systems. They request no alliance, tribute, or exchange. Only that their model be acknowledged as viable within current galactic norms. Assessment pending. Threat level unconfirmed. Tactical risk minimal. Ideological disruption escalating. He paused before the last line, then spoke it anyway. Recommend dialogue. Not for capitulation, but for understanding. The recording ended, and across the Varrock's silence took on a different tone, a silence no longer rooted in command, but in something colder and far less stable. There is a silence that follows threat, and another that follows understanding, and between them lies the silence of decision. Heavier than either, for 3 full orbital rotations, Varrock's silence remained in absolute stasis. The dreadnought tethered in low synchronous orbit above the nebula bastion like a sword held just above its target. Not yet dropped, not yet. Sheathed, the Terran vessel continued its quiet drift nearby, deliberately avoiding any shift in posture that might suggest preparation, evasion, or escalation, that no further communication had been initiated. The humans said nothing more, and that, more than anything, disturbed the command tier, because the weight had shifted. Now the burden of action no longer rested with the intruder, but with the authority that claimed to keep order. Kul-Varran convened a closed-tier deliberation inside the convocation chamber, a circular hall reserved for cases that required moral justification beyond tactical necessity. He had stood in this room only 3 times before, once during the Sulvari fragmentation, once during the decision to dissolve the Avexi line, and once to ratify the first sanctioned charter. Each time, the result had changed the region's diplomatic geometry for decades. Now, it might again. He began not with decree, but with a question. How do we respond to a species that does not seek advantage, but demands we reconsider how advantage is defined? The chamber remained still. Each member of the Triad Advisory Unit stood behind their respective banners. Military reason, ethical continuity, and strategic futures. It was Vel Tyr who finally broke the quiet. They are either fools wielding philosophy in place of survival. Or they've already survived more than we understand. A soft murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the inner advisors. Kul-Varran's eyes remained locked on the projection sphere, where the image of the Equinox still held its vigil without. Posturing. We have relied on deterrence for too long, said Resamthun, the delegate from ethical continuity, her voice firm but respectful. The presence of a fleet like ours was always intended to be the last word. But they've arrived with no voice of war, and instead handed us records, not of superiority, but of patience. And patience is not a strategy, grumbled Commander Halvik, representing military reason. It is a delay. A stall. The weak always present restraint when they lack capacity. You mistake intent for incapacity, Tyr said, folding his arms. What they've done is weaponized narrative. No species can study these records and not question the morality of our peace enforcement policy. Kul-Varran finally spoke again. The danger, Commander, is not that others will adopt the human method. It is that they will begin to ask why we haven't. And that, in truth, was the core of the problem, because the Sirotheen High Council had spent decades curating the idea that peace must be shaped through dominance. That fear was the language everyone eventually understood, and thus the most universal path to compliance. But the Equinox had introduced a rival thesis, that peace could survive on dignity alone. If one was willing to bear its cost, it had not come to challenge a fleet. It had come to challenge a doctrinaire. Followed Kul-Varran into his private chamber hours later, where the Admiral stood without his command mantle, arms clasped behind his back, his posture still as the stars beyond the viewport. They've said nothing else since the doctrine, Tyr reported. They don't need to, Kul-Varran replied. Then, what's the next move? The Admiral's voice was low. We grant them audience, not because we submit, not because we trust, but because we cannot afford to refuse without revealing the hollowness of our authority. Tyr studied him for a moment, and if they're sincere, Kul-Varran turned. Slowly, then we have more to learn, and we have to defend a formal message. Was dispatch coded through high-protocol diplomatic channels. Permission granted for direct envoy dialogue. Terms, non-escalatory. Location, Axis Platform Corvin's Trace. 1 representative per delegation. Observers permitted. Duration, 2. Be determined. It was sent at P-cycle standard response came at P. J confirmed. Ambassador Helena Voss will attend. And so, beneath the mirrored orbit of 2 doctrines, the one of domination and the one of discipline, plans were set for the first direct conversation between a Terran envoy and the enforcers of an empire that had never been told until now that its order was not the only path forward. Corvin's Trace had never hosted a delegation unarmed. The station itself was a marvel of Sirotheen restraint, hollow ring, open-aired, and graviton neutral. Designed for delicate negotiations, it allowed no fixed seating, no dominant perspective, and no shadows deep enough for advantage. Even the walls shimmered with chromatic neutrality, designed to adapt to the thermal signatures of its guests and create an illusion of equal ground. Yet, in all its years of service to the Concord, it had never once received an envoy who arrived not to trade, not to plead, not even to align, but simply to question. Helena Voss entered with neither guard nor aid. Her garments were dignified, but without pretense, pressed black with an old Terran design that bore no planetary insignia, no military tag, no ideological symbol. Her hands were bare. Her walk was slow. Her expression unreadable, but not unreadable in the way of deception. Rather, in the way of one who had already accepted all outcomes. Admiral Kul-Varran awaited her at the central convergence point, a flat hexagonal space with no chairs, no elevation, and no barriers. He too came alone, though he was flanked by the full weight of his species' historical presence. She did not bow. She did not extend a hand. She simply stood across from him. And when she spoke, it was not the voice of negotiation. It was the voice of premise. Thank you for agreeing to this, Admiral. I know what it costs a command such as yours to sit without precedent. Kul-Varran responded with cool precision, his voice textured by long decades of command, but absent any mockery. I did not come to entertain a protest, Ambassador. I came to verify the terms of your intrusion, and I accept that, she said. But if you're only here to verify the event, not the reason, then we're not yet speaking the same language. There was a pause, long enough to be deliberate. "Begin." "Then," he said, "what purpose do you believe overrides the boundary of Sirotheen space?" She exhaled quietly, not as one who is nervous, but as one preparing to place a very old truth on a very new table. "We came because 3 systems just beyond your patrol, Perimeter J-Vash, Horankau, and Sorlin Drift, have gone silent in less than a decade. We have records from before and after your enforcement fleets arrived. We see no signs of war, nor rebellion, nor collapse. We see only absence. Entire cultures, Admiral, that spoke, wrote, and danced 1 generation ago, and now do none of those things. You call that peace. We call that suffocation. They rejected Concord norms," Kul-Varran replied smoothly. "Their silence is the result of refusal, not repression, and is refusal now a death sentence? In all but name." That question did not echo it, settled. The Admiral's jaw shifted ever so slightly, the only physical cue that her words had struck. A nerve too deep to dismiss entirely. Those systems were offered structure, stabilization, and continued contact. They declined. Silence followed. "We did not erase them, Ambassador. We withheld continuation. That is not violence. No." She agreed. "It's omission. And omission, when institutionalized, becomes something indistinguishable from a slow erasure of dissent." She stepped forward slightly, not a challenge, not an encroachment, but a deliberate equalization. "You govern through what you do not. Allow and justify it by what you prevent. But if peace exists only because no one is allowed to speak against the framework, then it is not peace. It is containment." Kul-Varran regarded her carefully. "You misunderstand our role. We do not suppress, we filter. We guide civilization toward cohesion. And if the civilization you are guiding chooses another path, then it must face the costs of deviation. And yet your records," she said, "show no admission of cost, no record of consequence. Only empty systems and revised maps." Another pause, and then she continued, her tone softer now, more solemn than adversarial. "We came not to unmate your authority, Admiral. We came to offer evidence that another method exists. One that has been tested, one that requires no domination, one that preserves cultures even when they resist cohesion." Kul-Varran folded his arms, not defensively, but with the weight of an empire behind his gesture. "What you call preservation, we have long classified as entropy. Too many voices, too many paths, too many deviations, and order crumbles. We've seen it. We were born from it. And perhaps," she said, "that is why we, who were born in chaos, can show you that not all noise leads to collapse." That, finally, earned him silence, not the tactical kind, but the contemplative kind. He stood still, then spoke. "This is not a conversation. This is philosophy wearing the mask of diplomacy. We do not need another theory. We need function. Then test it," she said, eyes steady. "Not by accepting us, not by converting your fleets, just by witnessing. Let the doctrine of constraint be viewed. Let others decide if it is viable. Let freedom, Admiral, be allowed to justify itself, not because it was mandated, but because it survived scrutiny. It was not a threat. It was not a plea. It was a wager, a bet, placed not on strength, but on the resilience of an idea, and in the still air of Corvin's Trace, where no side was higher than the other." Kul-Varran did not answer immediately, because he had just been given something rare, a reason to reconsider without being forced to surrender. There was no declaration made at Corvin's Trace, no document signed, no hand extended to close a rift. Yet when Ambassador Voss stepped off the negotiation floor and returned to the Equinox, something irrevocable had shifted, not in territory, not in treaty, but in the way Kul-Varran stood as he watched her leave not, as a commander who had triumphed not as a sovereign who had been outmaneuvered, but as a man who had just been handed the most dangerous weapon he had ever seen, and it was an idea. The bridge of the Vorak's silence received its admiral in silence. No fanfare, no ceremonial reassurances, no elevation of tone. It was Vel Tyr who first approached him, data spike in hand, brows knitted in reluctant curiosity. What was said, Kul-Varran did not answer immediately. He walked instead to the central threat mapping bays, where models of potential Terran hostilities had been suspended in stasis since the Equinox entered orbit. Conventional attacks, misinformation campaigns, atmospheric subversion, and fleet misdirection patterns. He deleted them all without announcement, without justification. There will be no escalation, he said at last. Not today. Not by us. Tyr was careful with his voice. Sir, that decision contradicts standard Concord defensive matrix 4C. If we acknowledge unauthorized human presence without consequence, we permit precedent. Kul-Varran turned slowly, with the kind of gravity that didn't ask for attention. It commanded it by existing. And if we eliminate them, we prove their point for them. That fear is our only tool, that we do not listen, that we cannot afford contradiction. He paused. Tell me, strategist, what is more dangerous to a system of enforced peace? A fleet or a story that shows it was never necessary? Tyr said, nothing. But his silence was no longer dissented, was consideration. Helena Voss sat quietly in the forward meditative chamber of the Equinox, the glow of the Bastion Nebula filtering through the viewing panels in streaks of blue-gold radiation. She did not celebrate. She did not record a mission log instead. She simply sat. She did not mistake Kul-Varran's silence for agreement. She understood better than most that influence was not immediate, it was ambient. And when dealing with civilizations whose systems were older than our species' recorded memory, the most radical act was often not the confrontation itself. Surviving it with composure. In Kaklis Mera entered softly, carrying a transcript pad and an expression of hesitant optimism. They haven't followed us. No pursuit protocol. No intercept pings. Voss nodded. That was expected. Still, Mera said, watching her, you took a risk. You put it all on the doctrine. No fallback, no counter-argument. Just a mirror. Sometimes the mirror is the argument. You think they'll reflect on it. If they don't, she said softly, they'll have to explain why. And that may be more disruptive than the doctrine itself. Back aboard the Vorak's silence, a private channel opened between Kul-Varran and the Sirotheen High Council. Lit was an unrecorded conversation, a courtesy granted only to those whose decisions were measured not by popular expectation, but by the risk of deviation from long-standing assumptions. He did not waste time with ceremonial report. We did not fire. The voice that answered him was older than his commission, older than the dreadnought itself. Explain why not. Because they did not arrive with threats. Because their challenge was not to our fleet, but to our frame. And because the moment I destroyed them, I would have destroyed our justification for restraint. You believe they intended martyrdom? No, Kul-Varran said. They intended examination. Of us. By us. Publicly. Quietly. Relentlessly. What do they want? They want to remain separate, he answered. And visible. That is more dangerous than annexation. A pause. Do you recommend containment? Kul-Varran exhaled slowly. No, I recommend witnessing. Because if we silence them, others will ask why. If we listen, others may forget to fear us. But if we observe and survive the scrutiny, then perhaps we earn the peace we've been enforcing. There was no reply for a long time, and then the channel closed without ceremony later that cycle. Tyr approached him once more. Sir, do you believe they mean to change us? No, Kul-Varran replied. They mean to change what we believe, must be changed by force. And if they succeed, Kul-Varran looked once more toward the hull projection of the Equinox, now beginning a slow trajectory out of orbit, and perhaps humanity is not the anomaly. And what are they? The alternative. He said it without triumph, without fear, just the quiet realization that the most difficult weapon to face in the known galaxy was a patient, principled idea that refused to die. The Equinox was gone from orbit, but its presence had not diminished, only transformed, from physical proximity to conceptual consequence. A week passed in standard galactic time, 7 days without broadcast. 7 days without another incursion. 7 days during which no other Terran vessel crossed a boundary, delivered a message, or even responded to Sirotheen diplomatic pings. And yet, everywhere inside the Concord's observational matrix, small signals began to change shape. They came not from the humans, but from those who had watched them. Vernari of the Hollow Clades submitted a request to study the Doctrine of Terran Constraint under neutral review. The Trinix Scholars Tribunal asked to revisit Concord-approved historical records of Jivash and Koran Ka, which had long been sealed under post-intervention stabilizations. Even the Orith Cartel, the most politically cautious of the mid-ring powers, held a private session titled Alternatives to the Hegemonic Stabilization Framework, a Human Case. No system dared endorse the Terrans, but none dismissed them, because now there existed proof of another path, and worse, proof that it had already worked. Kul-Varran remained aboard Varak's Silence, declining all ceremonial appearances and refusing all external commentary. He was not isolating out of shame, nor out of confusion. He was listening. He read every dispatch that arrived from the periphery, every echo of what Helena Voss had planted not in territory, but in imagination. The Doctrine of Constraint had become a lens, and now all other species were beginning to look at the Concord through it. He stood alone in the Contemplarium, a rarely used, glass-bound chamber facing open vacuum, where High Command once made ritual vows during periods of war readiness. Here, Kul-Varran stood with arms clasped and the weight of history in his posture. Tyr entered without ceremony. We have received 32 requests for comment on the Equinox interaction, he reported. The Council wants to issue a formal classification, but no one agrees on what that classification should be. Kul-Varran did not turn, because it was not an incursion. No, and it was not a negotiation. No, sir. Then it was a challenge, he said at last, eyes fixed on the distant shimmer of stars. Not of sovereignty, not of jurisdiction, but of moral identity. You believe that's why others are responding. I believe, Kul-Varran said slowly, that the Equinox arrived not to offer us a new order, but to reveal that we no longer believe in the one we enforce. There was no disagreement in Tyr's silence, only the sound of realization settling where no rebellion had ever reached elsewhere. Far beyond Sirotheen space, the Equinox entered slipstream without ceremony. No escorts, no surveillance avoidance. The doctrine had done its work. It had not converted empires or overturned dominions, but it had paused them, introduced the possibility that restraint was not weakness, and in that pause, ideas had begun to stir quietly, dangerously, patiently aboard the Terran relay satellite Cadence II. Rotating deep in unmapped neutral sectors, a single message was received, decrypted through the lowest priority diplomatic buffer, flagged only because of its origin Sirotheen command-level encoding verified lineage. Admiral Kul-Varran, Varak's Silence message. We acknowledge the Doctrine of Constraint as internally coherent. We recognize the intent of the envoy as non-hostile. While not adopting the human model, the Sirotheen command considers it a variable in future stabilization S. No reply requested. No reply expected. We will observe. Helena Voss read it alone, seated at the outermost observation panel of Cadence II. Listening to the low hum of radiation fields and distant stellar telemetry, she smiled. Faintly, not a smile of victory, but the kind reserved for those who know the wheel of history has begun to shift quietly, unmarked by monument, unnoticed by empires, yet inevitable, because it was being watched now. And that, she knew, was the beginning of every true change. Not force, not conquest, but the moment when others begin to wonder what else is possible. In the high tower of Concord Judiciary Station Archiva Prime, where the strategic doctrines of over 100 systems were drafted, ratified, and embedded into galactic law, a single clause began to circulate among the senior ADJUDIC ATORS. It was unsigned. Unofficially yet, every reader paused when they saw it. What is not enforced may still be chosen. There was no attribution, no heraldry. Only the line, embedded in a footnote beneath a routine review of post-contact protocol amendments. But the phrasing bore unmistakable Terran cadence, deliberate, reserved, irreversible, and in a building where language had always followed command. This one quiet sentence had begun to change conversations, not in open sessions, but in the subtle shift of questions behind closed goals. Kul-Varran stood before a projection of Archiva Prime, watching data pulse across its outer shell, like veins of thought, each line a policy, each flare a vote. The Sirotheen fleet still held position, its authority intact, its command structures untouched. But the Admiral understood something few, in his circle yet did. Command was not always taken by force. Sometimes it was surrendered in thought. Tyr entered, his expression more fatigued than usual. Admiral, the Nasha Confederacy has released a public education document referencing the Doctrine of Constraint. They call it a case of moral asymmetry. Kul-Varran did not look away. That is their right. The Oryx delegation submitted a motion to open historical records of our interventions. They did not ask permission. Then the doctrine has done more than survive, he said, voice low. It has become usable. We could still dismiss it publicly, Tyr offered, but there was little conviction in his tone. Frame it as an ideological anomaly. Reassert control before others begin testing the model. Kul-Varran finally turned. Slowly. Control strategist is not restored by denying what is already being believed. If we dismiss it now, we confirm our fear. If we suppress it, we create martyrdom. If we embrace it, we create contradiction. He exhaled. So we watch. Not out of indecision, but because surveillance, without action, is a form of restraint. One we have not yet practiced. Meanwhile, in the independent orbitals of Ilian Tra, a neutral research station broadcast a symposium titled Voices Without Mandate, the Equinox Doctrine and Post-Hegemonic Peace. 5 species participated. Of them had never spoken publicly without Concord approval before. Their discussion was civil, measured, and deeply subversive. They asked, what does it mean to wield power and choose not to use it? Is civilization safest under containment or under dignity? What, precisely, have we accepted in the name of stability? None of these questions were framed as Terran propaganda. They were framed as the beginning of alternatives. On the 4th day after the broadcast, an unarmed Terran ship, Alethea, approached the edge of Sirotheen-defined space near the Coronai sector. It did not cross. It did not transmit. It simply held position. The gesture was unmistakable observation, not infiltration. Kul-Varran received the positional data without reaction. He stood in silence, reading the coordinates for a long moment, then said only, log them. No engagement. No response. Admiral, it's an unsanctioned vessel. Then let it be the first we do not sanction. And with that, he walked from the command deck. Humanity had not sent a fleet, had not broadcast a manifesto, had not sought supremacy. They had only sent a question, and now empires were beginning to answer, not aloud, not formally, But in the slow erosion of unquestioned foundations, the architecture of doubt was spreading, and where once the Sirotheen dictated peace as imposition, they now began to witness peace as a decision that others were making without them. Not a collapse knot, yet but a quiet shift in gravity. The Admiral who had once stood above every doctrine now stood within one he did not create, still sovereign, still watched, but no longer alone in the shaping of order it was not celebrated. There was no anthem, no monument, no diplomatic gathering to mark the change. But the shift, once begun, became irreversible, not in flame or conquest, but in the fading sound of command no longer echoed. The Concord Council convened in full quorum for the first time in 24 cycles. Not to pass a resolution, nor to initiate sanctions, but to ask a question not heard in its chambers since the beginning of the enforcement era. What shall we become if we are no longer feared? No answer was recorded in the minutes. None was needed, because across the assembled systems, in halls once built to secure compliance, a new understanding had taken root. The Doctrine of Constraint had not demanded allegiance. It had only offered evidence, not of superiority, but of sufficiency, that peace, true peace, could survive not by force, but by principle. That dignity could be chosen, not imposed. It was not a new empire. It was the end of needing one. HFY Sci stood alone once again, this time on the terraformed rim of a neutral moon station in the Polari cluster, where atmosphere regulators hummed beneath her boots and strange red grass had begun to take hold in the foreign soil. HFY Sci approached from behind, datapad in hand. "Word from Arkiva Prime," she said, passing it with a tone carefully controlled. "A new amendment draft. Not ratified yet, but it cites Terran precedent." Voss did not take the pad. She only listened. "They're calling it the contingency of consent," Mara continued. "It suggests that stability need not be enforced if a system demonstrates peaceful autonomy. No defensive presence required. And who decides what constitutes autonomy?" "They haven't agreed," Mara admitted. "But the fact that they're arguing about it means it's not theoretical anymore." Helena smiled, faintly. "The wind real or simulated?" She wasn't sure, brushed against her coat. "We never needed them to adopt our model," she said, "only to admit theirs wasn't inevitable." Back aboard the Vorak's silence, Kul-Varran stood once more. In his private chamber, a transmission paused mid-screen. It was not from the Council. Not from Concord leadership. It was from a minor colony governor in the Valex, fringe a place so politically insignificant. It had not appeared in any of the great enforcement charts for over 100 years. "We request that no stabilizer fleet be stationed near our orbit this cycle. Our citizens have expressed a preference for Terran-style passive monitoring, with all active presence withdrawn. We believe we can maintain civic harmony without further Concord projection. No threats. No rebellion, just a request." A choice. He read it twice then, a third time, then deleted it, not out of dismissal, but reverence, because the truth it contained did not need recording. It had already taken hold in him. The Equinox remained unarmed. It never became a flagship, never led. A fleet never raised a banner, but it had changed the vector of civilization. One question at a time, one encounter at a time, in the long quiet that followed across drifting stations and echoing archives. Among species once forced into stillness, something began to grow that no weapon could seed and no empire could dictate. Consent. It would take decades for the change to be named, centuries for the truth to be recognized. But it had begun here, in silence and in patience, and as Kul-Varran watched another generation rise into command, he understood the meaning of what HFY had left behind. Not a rebellion, not a doctrine, but the most dangerous idea of all that. Peace is strongest when it is not enforced, and so, for the first time in Sirotheen recorded history, he issued no order, he simply allowed